pick up this morning in Joshua chapter 4. You might feel like it's a little bit like Groundhog's Day. You might think, wait a minute, didn't we do this last week? So we get 2 Sundays on the crossing of the Jordan, but the emphasis this week is not on actually the crossing. You'll see as we get into it, but it's Joshua chapter 4. Before we start, I would remind you about how powerful a well-designed memorial can be. It will allow you to participate in an event that you otherwise might not know anything about. And you do it imaginatively. You can do it very emotionally. You can be moved by a well-designed memorial. And in 2000, I was in Washington, D.C. with my wife. And one of the things we wanted to do was the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. So I think we did it on it might have been a Friday, Thursday or Friday, we went through that memorial. And it's several hours. We may have spent close to 3 hours there. And I remember nearing the end of it just being emotionally wrung out. It was educational, but it's hard to see some of the things you see there. So one of the last exhibits was a wall that had some writing and 4,000 pairs of shoes that were actually shoes worn by people who were killed in the Holocaust. And just standing in front of those shoes, and you see the men's shoes and ladies' shoes. Some of the shoes are actually like women's shoes with heels, like dress shoes. And you see that shoe that a woman was actually wearing when she got on the train to go to Auschwitz or wherever it was they were being taken. You don't wear a dress shoe unless you think you're probably going to set up a life somewhere else. But most of these people had no idea they were going to their deaths. And there's pictures of like children's booties, and you see that and you think some mother was carrying her child onto that train with no idea about what might be about to happen to them. So you're standing there, and it's the only exhibit that I can ever remember that actually has a smell. There's this rubber-tinged smell. The longer you stand there, you start to actually pick up on that, all these shoes in that small space. But you stand there at the end of this, near the end of this memorial, and I'm noticing, my own shoes, and thinking that if I'd been born at another time in another place, maybe born Jewish, those could have been my shoes there. And it just seems like something so personal, seeing these shoes of these people who had died. When you first enter the memorial on the first floor, you find these words: "Only guard yourself and guard your soul carefully, lest you forget the things your eyes saw, and lest these things depart from your heart all the days of your life, and you shall make them known to your children and to your children's children." We have another memorial. We have one here in Oklahoma that's a powerful memorial, the Oklahoma City Memorial Museum downtown, National Memorial Museum, which I'm sure most of you have probably been there. And I did not personally know anybody who perished of those 168 people who died in that bombing. When you enter there, though, you see the words, "We come here to remember those who were killed, those who survived, and those who were changed forever. May all who leave here know the impact of violence." I've been there. I've seen those chairs lined up in the rows according to first row to maybe ninth row that indicated where the people who died were on that day at the time, like what floor they might have been on. There's a chair for people on the first floor and who may have worked on the second, third, fourth floor. And it sits there between the 901 and the 903 gate. And it's just a powerful memorial. And we've taken our children there. We've talked about what happened there. We talked about who did it and what their reasoning was for it, to try to help my children understand. And someday I would expect they'll take their children there and explain things as well. It's the function that memorials play. But just this week, the tragedy hit me in a different way. And it's because there are two small stone memorials on the opposite side from where we are. Over by the children's entrance, there's a flagpole there. And unless someone pointed you there, you would not recognize this. But there are two flat stones there at the foot of the flagpole. And one of those reads, "In memory of Don Fritzler, architect, Murrah Building bombing victim, April 19th, 1995, Quail Springs Baptist Church." I thought you probably might not get a chance to get out there and see it, but that's his memorial. And then there's one with his wife's name on it as well. It reads essentially the same, the Fritzlers. So I became interested in them beyond just this memorial there. So I was able to discover that Don was an architect. He designed churches. And like First Baptist Moore, he helped design that building. He also designed the building the 8:15 and 11 o'clock service happens in, the chapel. He was the architect for that building. I discovered that his wife, Mary Ann, was a retired school teacher. She taught Sunday school here. I don't know if anybody in this service might have known the Fritzlers. There were some in the 8:15 service who knew them. They had two children. They'd found out just a few weeks before the bombing that they were going to have their first grandchild, a little girl. And on April the 18th, 1995, the day before the bombing, they'd celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary. On the morning of the 19th, the Fritzlers had gone into the Social Security office at the Murrah Building to check on his retirement benefits. They both perished in the bombing. Standing in that worship space this morning, I was able to give thanks for Don and Mary Ann Fritzler. They ran their race well. They were faithful followers of Jesus. He actually designed the worship space that we will worship in twice today, and they passed the baton to us, and now we continue to run the race they ran. If not for those two memorials, we would not know, I would not know, Don and Mary Ann Fritzler. I would not know who they were, and I would not have been able to remember them. That's the power of memorials, of remembrance. And God has called his people to remember. And so when we come to Joshua chapter 4, the whole chapter is about remembering the events that have happened at the Jordan River. And it begins with the importance of remembering. Look at chapter 4, verses 1 through 9. After the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord spoke to Joshua. Choose 12 men from the people, one man for each tribe, and command them. Take 12 stones from this place in the middle of the Jordan where the priests are standing. Carry them with you and set them down at the place where you spend the night on the other side. So Joshua summoned the 12 men he had selected from the Israelites, one man for each tribe, and he said to them, "Go across to the ark of the Lord your God in the middle of the Jordan, and each of you lift up a stone onto his shoulder, one for each of the Israelite tribes, so that this will be a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, 'What do these stones mean to you?' you will tell them, 'The water of the Jordan was cut off in front of the ark of the Lord's covenant. When it crossed the Jordan's water was cut off. Therefore, these stones will always be a memorial for the Israelites.' And the Israelites did just as Joshua had commanded them. The 12 men took stones from the middle of the Jordan, one each for the Israelite tribes, just as the Lord had told Joshua. They carried them to the camp and set them down there. Joshua also set up 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan. That's a flashback where the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant were standing. The stones are still there to this day. There weren't two memorials. That's the same memorial. Apparently they set them up immediately there in the riverbed, but once the priests were gone, they picked them up, carried them to the other side, and there they established this memorial of 12 stones. We learned in last week, I just read it, I'm not even sure I made reference to it, but I did read the verse. In chapter 3, verse 12, in the midst of giving the instructions to the priests who are to carry the ark, and that they're going to step down into the water and the people are going to follow about a half mile behind. In the midst of all these specific instructions about how they're going to cross the Jordan, there was this odd little insertion at verse 12. Now choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, 1 man for each tribe. But there was no explanation, and there seemed to be no reason for choosing these 12 men. Now, when we come to chapter 4, we find out what that was about. Now, Joshua tells them, those 12 men that you chose, we'll get them together. And here's what I want them to do. When everybody's passed through, when all the Israelites have hurried across the Jordan, all that's left standing there are the priests holding the Ark of the Covenant. I want these 12 men to go down there into that dry riverbed and to select 12 stones. Now, it says something about how substantial these were. They didn't just carry them in their hand or in their tunic. They actually tossed it up on their shoulders. So these are good-sized stones. Choose one for every tribe. And now we start to understand why he wanted a representative for every tribe, because this monument, this memorial that's going to sit on the other side of the Jordan is going to represent the 12 tribes crossing the Jordan. So it was important that there be 12 stones, and that means 1 man from every tribe representing each tribe. Sounds like a well-designed memorial to me. And so they do precisely what Joshua has instructed them to do. We also find out why they're doing it. He says explicitly in verse 6, so that this will be a sign among you in the future when your children ask you, what do these stones mean? You will tell them, the water of the Jordan was cut off in front of the ark of the Lord's covenant. When it crossed the Jordan's water was cut off. And then he says, these stones will be a memorial for all Israelites. Now he comes back to this later in chapter 4. I'm going to go ahead and read verse 20 now. Then Joshua set up in Gilgal the 12 stones they'd taken from the Jordan, and he said to the Israelites, in the future, when your children ask their fathers, what's the meaning of these stones, you should tell your children, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. So he actually, in the earlier passage in verse 9 and then in verse 20, slightly tweaks what they're supposed to tell, but it is the same experience. First, he says, you're going to tell them, this is the place where God cut off the waters of the Jordan. This is the place where the priests carried the ark into the river, and when their feet touched the river, the waters dried up. And then in verse 20, and you'll tell them, this is where we crossed. Just adds that little nuance. But it's clear what this memorial is about. So that these Israelites in their lifetime will never forget what God had done for them at the Jordan River. And they will now have a trigger, a memorial, so their children can see it and they can point to it, and maybe the children will ask, what do these stones mean? Or maybe they'll take them there and show them, and they can teach their children what God had done for them at the Jordan River. If they don't teach their children, if there's no triggers that might cause them to talk about it and explain it to them, then after the generation that crosses the Jordan dies, the next generation won't know. And so we learn the importance of remembering and establishing memorials, remembrances, triggers to help our memory. I think we all recognize how sad it is to forget. I mean, lots of bad things happen to us because we forget. We forget a meeting we're supposed to keep. We forget a birthday or an anniversary or a present we were supposed to buy. We forget to fill out papers in a timely fashion. We forget to file our taxes. No, never that. But when you forget important things, we often pay a high price for it. Sometimes we forget intentionally. We want to forget. But most of the things we forget because we just can't remember. I taught with a man at OBU some years ago. I guess he's been retired now about 10 years. And he lived in my neighborhood. I knew him at work. We weren't hanging out kinds of friends, but we were friends. He was a very nice man, a good teacher in the School of Education. And one day I got a call at the office from my wife telling me the story of encountering his wife in the neighborhood. My wife was outside on the front porch. His wife was walking in the neighborhood, and my wife perceived that she was crying. She thought she was crying and that she might seem a little confused. My wife went to her and discovered that that was exactly the case. She was confused. She couldn't find her way back home. She was a block away. You could see her house from where they were standing in the road. And so my wife called me. She was with his wife there, had her with her on the porch. I was able to get in contact with her husband. He went home. And that's the day we found out that she had Alzheimer's. And so we were aware that they were walking through that challenging experience. After she had died, we were talking about some of the things he'd gone through with her. And he said, it's one of the saddest stories I know. He said the low point was the day he walked into the room and she could not remember who he was. We must not forget the importance of remembering. And not just facts, not just what happened, but remembering the significance of those events. What did they mean? When the stones are set up, they're not just going to point and say, look, we came through the Jordan there. That's not going to be all these Israelites are going to teach their children. They're going to teach them a great deal more about God and his faithfulness by virtue of pointing to this memorial. We've got to move beyond thinking that just knowing the facts about the Bible or about Israel's history is enough for you to know the God of Israel and the God of the Bible. Just knowing the facts is not sufficient. I mean, someone can study academically the Bible and not know God. This might be a person you want on your Bible trivia team every time, but they might not know God. These memorials are not just to point us to past events, but so that we can also remember the significance of those events. There's in fact 7 memorials in the book of Joshua, and we're probably going to hit most of them in a sermon. Now, it won't be a memorial sermon again, but I'll at least mention them. So this is the first. When we get to chapter 7, there's going to be a very different kind of memorial. You may have heard of a man named Achan. When they take Jericho, Achan is going to take some of the spoils from the city that he was forbidden to take. They're not supposed to profit individually from their taking of these cities. So Achan had taken some expensive items from the city of Jericho. And as a result of that, they were defeated at the next city, Ai. 36 Israelites died. They ran like cowards. And Joshua's like, God, what are you doing? What happened? Where are you just bring us out here to be defeated? And God says, no, there's sin in your camp. And through a process, they were able to identify it was Achan. And Achan and his entire family were brought out, animals, everything related to his household are brought out to the valley of Achor, which means valley of trouble. They stoned he and his family to death there, and they were burned. And then they heaped those stones up over them as a memorial. Now that was a reminder of what disobedience to God can do, the danger of disobedience to God. Then after they go back and defeat Ai, the king of Ai is killed, and they take his body, and guess what they do? They pile stones on top of it so they can point there and say, there lies the king of Ai. God gave us that city. All the way to chapter 24, where in the closing scene where Jeremiah has a sort of a farewell sermon, he sets up stones of remembrance of the covenant that they've made with God, of the need for them to continue to be obedient to God, a reminder of God's covenant and promises to them. And when he gives his farewell speech, it's there at a monument to God's covenant. in Joshua chapter 24 at the place called Shechem. So memorials are going to be important in the book of Joshua. It's the importance of us remembering what God has done. Now, verses 10 through 18, we find the importance of faithful leadership. We talked about leadership last year a little bit more today. But in verses 10 through 18, we're reminded of how important it is to have faithful leadership. Beginning at verse 10, the priests carrying the ark continued standing in the middle of the Jordan until everything was completed that the Lord had commanded Joshua to tell the people, in keeping with all that Moses had commanded Joshua. The people hurried across, and after everyone had finished crossing, the priests with the ark of the Lord crossed in the sight of the people. The Reubenites, Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh went in battle formation in front of the Israelites as Moses had instructed them. About 40,000 equipped for war crossed to the plains of Jericho in the Lord's presence. On that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they revered him throughout his life as they had revered Moses. And the Lord told Joshua, command the priests who carry the ark of the testimony to come up from the Jordan. So Joshua commanded the priests, come up from the Jordan. And when the priests carrying the ark of the Lord's covenant came up from the middle of the Jordan, and their feet stepped out on solid ground, the water of the Jordan resumed its course, flowing over all the banks as before. You notice back in verse 10, the priests carrying the ark continued standing in the middle, but notice the line, in keeping with all that Moses had commanded Joshua. Now go back to chapter 1 and look at verse 12. So Joshua 1:12. Joshua said to the Reubenites, the Gadites, the half-tribe of Manasseh, remember what Moses, the Lord's servant, commanded you when he said, the Lord your God will give you your rest. Now do you remember this? We did this when we did the sermon from chapter 1. The Reubenites, the Gadites, that's two of the tribes, and Manasseh east, half the tribe of Manasseh, already had their land. They had agreed with Moses that they would have land on the east side of the Jordan. And they wouldn't actually live in the promised land. They just lived just outside of it on the other side of the Jordan. They defeated Sihon and Og, these two Amorite kings, and Moses said, yep, let's do that. And Joshua acknowledges that. But Moses had told them, when we go into the land, when we actually cross the Jordan, your fighting men have to go too. You can't just take your rest and enjoy your land. You've got to fight with the other 9.5 tribes until they take possession of the west side of the Jordan. Joshua is reminding them of that here in chapter 4. He's doing exactly what Moses had commanded them, which God had commanded him to follow. And then verse 14, on that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel. They revered him throughout his life as they revered Moses. He's following the same pattern that Moses did. He is obedient to God, and because of that, God has elevated him. Now, this is just in crossing the Jordan. They've not taken the land yet. But when we get to chapter 11, they're actually going to take the land. We're in the process of taking it when we get to 11. But look at what Joshua tells us when they're actually taking possession of the land. Chapter 11, verse 12. Joshua captured all these kings and their cities and struck them down with the sword. He completely destroyed them as Moses, the Lord's servant, had commanded. Again, in verse 14, the Israelites plundered all the spoils and the cattle. They struck down every person with the sword until they had annihilated them, leaving no one alive, just as the Lord had commanded his servant Moses. There is a theme here in Israel's leadership. Israel's very strong leadership. Moses was a great leader. If you want to see what a leader among God's people looks like, if I had a picture of Moses, I'd put it up there right now. I'd say, there's a picture of a leader, Moses. But what was his genius? I mean, you can break down his character and his endurance and his compassionate heart. And I mean, you can find a lot of character traits that you'd say, man, that would make a great leader. But the thing at the heart of his leadership was he was faithful to God. He could have had all these traits of leadership, but if he were not obedient to God, he would have been an utter failure as a leader of Israel. And now that leadership has been passed on to Joshua. And what is Joshua doing? He's being obedient to God and to the things that Moses had commanded. He's following that same leadership pattern of faithfulness to God. Apparently, Israel didn't need Moses' skill set at this moment in time. They needed Joshua's. And so God has raised up Joshua to be the one who leads them into the land and actually leads them to take possession of it. It's the way God works. In your own situation, I had the privilege of knowing Charlie Graves. I didn't know him as your pastor ever, but I did meet him in his retirement. I taught Bible studies over here several times, got to meet with him, talk to him. It was my privilege to get to know Charlie Graves. It's clear to me that Charlie Graves was an excellent pastor who led this church well. He was faithful to God. And then Hans Dilbeck was your pastor. And Hans Dilbeck was a faithful pastor and leader of this church. His skill set as a leader was very different than Charlie's, but he's the person this church needed for those 15 years, and he was a faithful leader. And then I think this church needed a different skill set. And for 5 years, Stephen Rummage led you well. He was a faithful pastor leader. And now, apparently, you need a different skill set for the future. And God is preparing somebody who will be a faithful leader. It is the core of faithful, strong leadership, obedience to God. And then finally, there's the importance of seeing God's greater purpose in these events. So we get to verse 19. The people came up from the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month and camped at Gilgal on the eastern limits of Jericho. Then Joshua set up in Gilgal the 12 stones they'd taken from the Jordan, and he said, in the future, when your children ask their fathers, what's the meaning of these stones, you'll tell them, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the water of the Jordan before you until you'd crossed over, just as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. This is so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Lord's hand is strong, and so that you may always fear the Lord your God. What a great moment in Israel's history it is when they crossed the Jordan River and finally set their feet on the promised land. This is like mind-boggling in its importance. They've been looking for this land for over 400 years, and now their feet are planted in it. Now, there's a lot of work to be done, but crossing the Jordan and standing in the promised land is such a great moment. But it's just a moment. And that moment is part of a whole series of important events that point to something much larger than that specific moment itself. Joshua does it here. He reminds them about how God dried up the Red Sea when they crossed it in the Exodus. It tells you that, these events are connected and they're part of a larger story that he says, so that all the peoples of the earth may know. How does a particular event in Joshua or Exodus or 1 Samuel or even in the Gospels, how does that connect to God's larger purposes in the world? If you get only locked in on the facts, on the what happened, and you don't ask the question of what does it mean, you're missing it completely. The crossing of the Jordan is part of a larger story. Now, if you've heard this from me before, good. I hope I've said this before, and I'll likely say it again. Here's the big story that you need to have in mind when you read the Bible. It starts with creation, where a good God creates a good world. He says that after every day of creation. And at the end, he says it's very good. And he places in this world Adam and Eve, human beings created in his image. And they have a particular task. They are to rule on his behalf. They are his image bearers. And they're to rule it well. Not destroy it, not damage it, but lead it so that it can be everything God made it to be. That's Genesis 1 and 2. But man, that story takes a hard turn in chapter 3 of Genesis, because rather than leading well, Adam and Eve disobeyed God, eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and because of that, instead of leading and building God's creation, they opened the floodgates for its destruction. And they were never the same. Removed from Eden, not able to return. And that began a journey for them and for all successive human beings to try to get back to paradise. Paradise lost, but hopefully paradise regained. And God, in Genesis 12, began the work of redeeming the creation. And you know who he did that through? Starting with Abraham. When God called Abraham, and he said, I'm going to give you descendants, and they're going to be great. I'm going to give them a great name. I'm going to put them in a land where they will be a great nation, and they will be a blessing to all nations. That's the beginning of God's redemptive plan. Well, you know what had to happen in order for that plan to go forward? Abraham and Sarah had to have a son whose name was Isaac. Now, that was a great moment in their lives when they found out that Sarah, at like 90, was pregnant. And when she actually gave birth to that healthy baby boy, what a great moment. But that was bigger than just Abraham and Sarah having a baby. That had to happen so that God's story would go forward. And when they were enslaved in Egypt, God had to bring them up out of there in order for his grand redemptive story to go forward, because they've got to get to the promised land. And when they were wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, they had to eventually come out of there, because they had to get to the promised land to be that nation out of which the Messiah would be born. When they crossed the Jordan River, that moment is significant not just for them, but for God's grand redemptive story, because that nation in that land will be the beginning of the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. What's the significance of that story? How does it fit into God's larger redemptive purpose? That's what we always have to ask. What do these stones mean? And then you get to the Gospels, and Jesus sets up a little memorial. It involves bread and it involves wine. And he said, whenever you eat and drink this going forward, this is my body, this is my blood, do this in remembrance of me. I mean, that was an important moment for those disciples and for Jesus, but if you don't understand the significance of that moment for God's redemptive plan, you're missing the point. That's the critical moment. He's giving his life, he's shedding his blood for the redemption of the creation. Indeed, what do these stones mean? We stand here today, beginning of February, and you'll find these around the church. It's a little logo. I'd call it a trigger to help you remember that in April, early April, we're going to celebrate this church's 75th anniversary. It gives us the opportunity to ask, indeed, what do these stones mean? Where have we come from? What is God doing right now? And where are we going? What part does Quail Springs Baptist Church have to play in God's grand story of redemption? What do these stones mean?